Good morning, fellow saints. It's good to see you all. And have a little game to play with you this morning. This is, see how well you do. I'm convinced that you're going to do great in it. 3 simple questions. Okay? All right, what's missing? What is missing? Okay? Can anybody figure this out? E? Raise your hand if you think it's an E. You're brilliant. You're brilliant. Those who didn't raise their hand in the back, you're not brilliant. Okay? All right, let's try this one. O. Oh my goodness, you're awesome. Okay? All right, let's try this one. U. U is missing out of there. Okay, so let's look at that close. Okay, you think it's the letter U, don't you? I say that it's U. Ah, you tricked me. It's not even a letter. It's U. You can't be missing from church. That's very, very important because this morning's lesson is Forsaking the Assembly. Ouch, Doug, it's fellowship meal day. I was going to feel good. I brought Alka-Seltzer and everything. Well, that's okay. Sometimes we come to church to learn. And sometimes lessons might step on our toes. In fact, if we read the Bible only expecting to feel good about ourselves, then you don't need Jesus anymore. We're in constant need of improvement. And so I want to draw your attention to this. In a 2006 Gallup poll of church attendance in America, okay, Americans who give their affiliation as Church of Christ are more likely than any other group to attend weekly worship services, Gallup reports. Consistently, Churches of Christ, number 1. 68% of Church of Christ members interviewed in this particular poll said they attend services at least once a week or almost every week, according to the poll released on April 14th, 2006. There have been other polls since then, same thing. Here's the rankings, right here. Okay, at number 9, the Episcopal Church, only 32% of its members attend any service in any one week. Lutheran 43, Presbyterian 44, Methodist 44, Catholic is 45%, Southern Baptist 60%, Pentecostal 65%, the Mormons 67%, but Church of Christ is 68%. Now, a lot of people, we don't realize that. But there's always been an emphasis in the Lord's church in having good attendance. And why is this, though? Well, this is a commonly quoted passage for it, right here. Hebrews 10, 23 through 25. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who has promised is faithful. And now let us consider how to stimulate one another to love and good deeds, not forsaking our own assembling together, as is in the habit of some, but encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. For if we go on sinning willfully, after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and a fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. How many times have you heard that we shouldn't forsake the assembly? And the assembling together. Now, the argument can be made that this is talking about more than just church attendance, the worship attendance. But it's certainly inclusive to this very thing. Let's cover the background just a little bit. What was going on in the Christian world during this time? Well, they were under a tremendous persecution. Hebrews was written probably about 69 AD, a year before the destruction of Jerusalem. And what was happening is all these first generation Christians who came out of Judaism, they left Judaism. Remember, to the Jews first, also to the Greeks. And so this generation, by the tens and thousands and even hundreds of thousands of first generation Christians who left Judaism, many of them, they were being taken out of the will. They were being shunned by their Jewish families. They were kicked out, scattered abroad. Hebrews 8, verse 4 and 5. Acts chapter 8, verse 4 and 5. They were spread out, the dispersia. And they were being persecuted. But now Jerusalem is about to be surrounded by General Vespasian, and then his son Titus would take over. And they would encompass the city and destroy Jerusalem. This is what's coming. So there was a lot of patriotic Judaism going on. They were like trying to get everybody back, saying, oh, you got to come back. If you come back, we'll write you into the will. We'll forget this ever happened. Just deny Christ, come back. You owe it to the Jewish nation to be here to defend against Rome. This is what else Hebrews says. But remember the former days when, after being enlightened, you endured great conflict of suffering, partly being made a public spectacle through the reproaches and tribulations. I mean, this stuff that Paul was doing to the Jews by hauling them back, pulling them by the hair, and committing them to trial, having them killed, having them executed, stoned, partly by being made a public spectacle through reproaches, tribulations, partly becoming sharers of those who were so treated. If you were sympathetic to anybody, you couldn't come out. Talk about censoring. They did censoring back then. You couldn't come out and say, that's just wrong. That's my brother. Boy, that was a pretty scary time. They put a big sign out there that said, Church of Christ meets here. For you were showed sympathy to the prisoners. You accepted joyfully the seizure of your property, knowing you yourselves have a better possession and an abiding one. This is leading into the hall of faith, chapter 11 of Hebrews. And what was going on is they were being persecuted. Now they're trying to lure them back. They're trying to say, if you just come back in this Jewish patriotism, just deny Christ, come back and join the nation again. And this is why the book of Hebrews was written, to help them to keep hanging on to the faith, because there is a huge pull to go back. Patriotism is a very powerful spiritual concept, but it must never be allowed to trump Christianity. If we're a Christian, it's okay to be patriotic, but if your patriotism calls you to be less of a Christian, then you have a decision to make. And so did they. And so they were constantly being persecuted for Christ. And so that was how they were asked to meet. Now imagine, let's put ourselves in their position. Because if we're going to go back to Hebrews chapter 10 and talk about not forsaking the assembling of the saints. And when you say in that context, the assembling of the saints, it's talking about, first and foremost, the gathering together of the church body. And it can also permeate into areas like Peter when he denied knowing Christ. That was a forsaking at that point. But it's talking about the gathering of the saints. You know, by the end of the first century, you remember on our church letterhead, you have the fish symbol, which is an ichthus, that's fish. And that was an early Christian symbol of how the churches met on the first day of the week. It was an acronym. Iota, chi, theta, upsilon, sigma, which is how you spell fish. Iota, that's how you say Jesus. Jesus. You had to agree to 5 words. And here's how they'd meet. You'd have to agree to 5 words. Iota, Jesus, Christos, that he's the Christ. Iota, Christo, Uyu, he's the Son. He's Sigma, the Savior. You'd have to agree to these principles. And what you do is, remember, it was outlawed. You couldn't go and meet with the church. You couldn't do it. Imagine if somebody come in and bust your family up and say, you can't meet. If we catch you meeting, we're going to haul you to Geary County Jail. And we're going to put you in solitary confinement. And we're going to repossess all that you own. And we'll maybe even kill some of your family. That's what was going on. So what they do is, if I was looking for someone to worship with in the first century, or at the going into the second century, I would be standing outside on the first day of the week, and I'd draw 1/2 with my foot, this half moon shape. And then I'd stand there, and I'd wait. And then perhaps a brother or a sister would come by, they'd see that, and just like here on the floor, they would draw the other part of the fish. And then we'd smear it out with our feet, and we'd go and we'd meet somewhere in a cave, somewhere. That's how the Christians were assembling. That's where ichthus came from. It wasn't because Jesus had fish. No, it's because that is a symbol of the early Christians who were persecuted on their desire to meet together on that first day of the week. That's the context this is in. So when it says, don't forsake the assembly, it isn't like what we'd have today. Take it times 1 billion and put the pressure of the weight of the world in possible execution if you meet with your brothers and sisters. Yet they still did it. By the end of the first century, it's estimated that 25% or 65 million of the 250 million Roman Empire population had converted to Christianity by the end of the first century. They couldn't stop it. See, you can't stop a good and truthful thing. And people would say, I don't care. I'm not going to forsake my assembling together with my saints. That's the context that we find it in. And with that in mind, fellowship with the saints. There's a reason we meet on the first day of the week. There's a reason. God chose this for a reason. John 20, verse 1. It's based on the fact Jesus rose from the grave on the first day of the week. John 20, verse 1. Now the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken from the tomb. The whole entire existence of our Christianity is centered in the fact that Jesus emptied the tomb. He was confirmed the Son of God with power through the resurrection of the dead, Romans 1:5, 1 Corinthians 15:1 through 4. Our whole faith is anchored in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. You take that out, no Christianity. It is the defining thing, an empty tomb. And so we worship together on the first day of the week. Why? Because this is the day Jesus emptied the tomb and made it possible for us to become a people of God's own possession, zealous for good works. It is designated time period for which we assemble with others who've been saved by the blood of Jesus. This is our day. You know, Gina said to me when I got out, she said, Happy Lord's Day. Every Sunday is Happy Lord's Day. That's it. I mean, we're going to meet together. We have a wedding rehearsal today. A wedding rehearsal. Can you imagine if you missed your own wedding rehearsal? You know, I actually had one like that. The groom's car broke down on the way down. We did the wedding rehearsal without the groom. Awkward. Very, very awkward. And you know what? It didn't go so well for him later on. Because he also forgot to pick up the ring. Yeah. Ouch. We meet the first day of the week, and it's the only specific. There were many days that Christians met in the first century. Oh man, they were always meeting together. Man, they're finding a reason. Hey, you want to get together? Yeah. But the only one we know absolutely, positively for sure that they always met together was the first day of the week. That one, always that way. It was on the first day of the week that the Corinthians gathered together and took up a collection. 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2. It was the first day of the week Paul gathered with the church at Troas to break bread. 20, verse 7 of Acts. It was on the first day of the week that the Holy Spirit was poured out on the first church leaders during their first gospel sermon that was preached to the first members of the location of the first congregation of the Lord's church during the first Christian worship on the day of Pentecost, and that's anchored in Leviticus chapter 23, verse 16. It was the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, that John was transformed through the vision of the heavenly portal to the holy worship service of God of Revelation chapter 4, verse 5. I mean, God has a thing about the first day of the week, and the thing is, that's when Jesus emptied the tomb. That is the thing. Paul says, I determined to know nothing among you but Christ and Him crucified. He called it first importance, 1 Corinthians 15. And so, fellowship is good. And God did not save us to become an island to ourselves. You know, Genesis 2, verse 18. You remember that. Genesis 2, verse 18. God says it's not good for a man to be alone. If you just take it in the terms of the man and Ed, yeah, absolutely. Because if you've ever seen a bachelor's apartment, it can be pretty bad. But if you take mankind, it's not good for any of us to be alone. That's one of the four components you have of a deteriorating in spirituality. If you're cold, if you're hungry, if you're lonely, loneliness is a terrible thing to have. And God designed us, as we covered in the last lesson, to sharpen one another. As iron sharpens iron, so does one man sharpen another. This is why this lesson comes after the last one. Ecclesiastes 4 verse 12 says, if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. James 5:16, confess your faults one to another, pray for one another. Colossians 3:16, teaching and admonishing one another. 1 Thessalonians 5 verse 11, encourage one another, build up one another. God designed us to be a one another people. And He wants us to meet together on the first day of the week to commemorate the very core of our existence. And when you find people who biblically claim to be Christian, there also has to be the biblical time that you set. We're going to have a meeting at this time. It's not once a year. It's not once a quarter. It's one time, one day, every week. Everything else beyond that is a bonus. And there's no substitute for it. You know, there's this mindset, and I know you've heard it before. Well, you know, you don't have to go to church to be a Christian. Yeah? Well, you don't have to spend any time with your kids to be a father either. Tell me how that turns out. You don't have to swim to be a duck. You know, let's stop playing games with this. We meet together because God knows we need that. We need that. We have to have that. It's part of a well-balanced spiritual diet. And as stated before, there were many times a week that we could have fellowship with one another. But one particular where we have a collective worship to the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. I'm focusing on this particular one because I'm persuaded that forsaking this designated event is quite a bit more about the heart of the individual than the clock. But unexcused and excused absence. Well, we need to look at things like that. There are many different type of reasons why we might not show up. Emergencies. Serious illness or injury would be another one. You know, I knew a sister in Christ, she was getting ready to go to church. She was like 78 years old, and she had fallen down and broke her arm. She didn't make it to worship that day. And it's not a matter of what I think, because it's our heart that we have to live with. This isn't a matter of judging anybody. You have to judge yourself. That's the thing. So if you feel insecure at the end of that, that's your problem. And that's okay. Because everything applies to me, applies to you. It always goes back to the heart. Travel. Sometimes when you're traveling, obviously, you know, we live in a world that's spread out. If we were all living in a time of Gulliver's Travels or something, maybe when your whole family, everybody lives here, everybody's spread out. Sometimes you can't be here with that, but we do our best to try and go worship where the saints meet. And if you don't do that, that's a great joy. It's a tremendous joy to get another slice of what heaven's going to look like. Minor illnesses, headaches, sore muscles, sniffles, stiffness. You know, in the pandemic, you really have to ask yourself if, I don't feel that good. I could have something. You reason it right here. Reason it here. Visitors from out of town. Some people have said to me before over the years, when I check on them, hey, how you doing? How you doing? I didn't see you this Sunday. I didn't know, are you sick or something? No, I had family that came in from out of town. Okay, think to yourself. God blesses you with a family. To me, this is how I would process it. In order for me to forsake this family to spend time with other family when they could have just come with me or just taken the time, I'd have to process that. That'd be difficult. It's my heart I have to live with. It's my heart. Anything I say is about me. Not speaking for you. You speak for you and speak to your heart. Just plain tired. Okay? What if you're just plain tired? Did I turn that off? I think I did. Just plain tired. If somebody said, I didn't go to church because I'm just plain tired, well, maybe they're sick. Maybe you got to reason that out. Personal grudges. There are some people that I know in the past who didn't want to come to church because somebody else was there. Well, you think that'd be excused or unexcused? Down in Sundown, Texas, when I was going to school, went to this little tiny congregation, and there was this husband and wife. They'd been married since the crust of the earth was cooling. They were around for a long time. And I was just sitting there talking with them. That's great. And how long you been going to church here and stuff? It was like 60 years. And little tiny town. And the wife said, well, it wasn't always like that, though. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, my husband, and he was just sitting there listening. My husband, one time, he decided he wasn't going to come to church. I got up. We would walk to church. Only lived 6 blocks away. Young couple. I got up. He's sitting in his pajamas, having a coffee, reading the paper. She says, aren't you coming to church? I'm not going there. There's nothing there but a bunch of hypocrites. She said, okay. She was walking out. She came back in. She says, honey, I was thinking, I guess it kind of boils down to this. You can go worship with the hypocrites today or burn in hell with them tomorrow. It's your choice. And she started walking down the street, and that husband beat her to church. He drove the car. His hair was still wet. He wasn't shaven. His clothes are disheveled. He ripped and threw those clothes on, and she said, we never miss church. Employment. Sometimes your job calls for. Let me tell you what I was doing this morning. 3:50 this morning. 3:50 this morning a.m. I got a call. I was on call for work, and we had a patient who passed. I had to go out for about 3 hours. I did come back, sleep another hour, but sometimes our job, depending upon what we do, you don't have a choice. But another thing, too, is if you've chosen a job that makes it to where you can't come, and there's other choices, you got a reason in your heart. You got to ask yourself, did I choose a career path that made it to where I don't come? We could always find some reason not to go to church. The question is it a good reason? Shame. Sometimes people, maybe they're in sin. They've said or done something. They said, no, I'm not going to do that. But that's already kind of set in. Entertainment. I knew somebody who I was talking to, a brother from another area, and we were visiting. And they went ahead and they had about 5 or 6 brothers. They lived in a location of a professional sports team in Philadelphia. And they weren't going to miss an Eagles game. And so they would go out and have their little tailgate worship where they were at. Interestingly, though, that I think all 5 of those are not faithful to this day. You see, why wouldn't you want to meet with your church family? I want to tell you a story. You might have heard this, but I don't remember telling you this story. I got a better memory than some of you, so it'll be new anyway, if that's the case. There was this preacher made a habit of going out when somebody wasn't there. He would go out and kind of visit, just check on them. And he went out to this old boy's house one day. He hadn't seen him in a couple of weeks, and he knocked on the door, and he hears this sound in there. Somebody's here, scurrying around, and something's wrong here. He goes, boom, boom, boom. Brother, it's the preacher. I'm just checking in on you. And he says, here's the sound. Oh no, it's the preacher. Oh no, scurrying around. Preacher goes, boom, boom, boom. Brother, I love you, open the door. I'm here because I love you. And dead silence. Curtain opens up just a little bit and closes. So that preacher, he takes out a piece of paper and writes Revelation 3 verse 20 on it. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man opens up to me, I will come unto him. And he goes and preaches his Sunday evening sermon. This is pre-pandemic. And he comes out from that evening sermon, and he has a note under his windshield wiper. So what's this? And he pulls it out. It says Genesis 2:10. He opens up and thumbs over there. It says, I heard thee in the midst of the garden, but I was naked and afraid, so I hid myself. Attendance in worship is important. It truly is important. And so we have to ask ourselves at the end of each thing, this is what it is. Let a man examine himself, and in so doing, let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Paul says in 2 Corinthians chapter 15, examine yourselves to see whether we are in the faith. Examining ourselves, giving ourselves a spiritual examination on all things is healthy. So what's the difference between an unexcused and excused absence? That's not up to me to call for you, and that's not up for you to call to me, but it's absolutely for us to put it in front of the mirror and look at our heart. This is the big thing. It's the priority of the heart. Because guess what? God sees the heart. He knows the thoughts and intents of the heart. Rule number 1, do not judge somebody else. Number 2, absolutely judge yourself. Because no matter where you go, there you are. And your conscience will be there. Now here's one for you. Oh, don't go there, Doug. Don't go there. Is being habitually late similar to partially forsaking the assembly? I was asked that question before. I've struggled with it. You know, down in Texas, a congregation that I preached at when I was going to school at SIBI, little tiny church, but there was this guy who would show up. I mean, they literally never deviated from the exact pattern that they've used for decades. 2 songs and a prayer, and you know the routine. And this guy and his wife would come in 5 minutes before the Lord's Supper, take the Lord's Supper, and then leave 5 minutes after the Lord's Supper. You might have even seen things like that before. Like they're coming in, I punched the card. And that really bothered me because I'm thinking, I've been working here for 5 months. I still don't know who they are. I've been told who they are, but they just come to the Lord's Supper. So one Sunday, I decided to change up the order of worship. Sermon came before the Lord's Supper. And you know what? They came in exactly at that same time as I got to stand up and preach. And they were there the entire time. And then after the end, he walked up to me and shook my hand and said, "Wow, I didn't know you were changing worship up." And I said, "Yeah, we don't want to worship the pattern of worship." And he said, "You know, I learned a lot today." And there was a potluck as well, a fellowship meal. And then he changed that behavior. But he was going just simply to punch a clock. So the question is, being partially here, choosing to be partially here, is that partially forsaking the assembly? I think that's something that we have to wrestle with. So the challenge is this. When you see people who've not been in church for a short time, we should call and check on them, because it is important. It's very, very important. You know, even when we were all wearing masks, it's important we see each other's face, that we have some face time. Before there was FaceTime, there was real FaceTime. Understand why attendance with the assembly is not important. That's what happens if you're too tired when you type up this. Communicate to others why attendance in the assembly is important. I want to close with this story. The 100-year-old Christian. True story. There was a 100-year-old church member who was having his birthday celebration at the church building in a congregation, and he had attended that congregation for like 85 years. That's a long time. And they had a meal, and then after the meal, a grandson said, hey, let's go to the auditorium so Grandpa can maybe say some kind words. Because, 100 years old, and this is the only place he's ever worshiped. This is his home. And somebody asked this 100-year-old Christian, because he couldn't hear that well, he couldn't see that well. But he got up with his cane, and somebody yelled out, what keeps you coming? You can't really hear, and you can't see that well, but you never miss worship. This is what he said. Because I love Jesus with all my heart. He wants me to be here, and I just want to show everybody whose side I'm on.